The scandal broke like a thunderclap across London society, shattering Lady Eveline Harcourt's fragile composure before she could even gather breath. One moment she had been the quiet niece of a royal household lady-in-waiting, valued for her gentleness and her impeccable conduct. The next she found herself standing in the cold center of a drawing room while whispers swarmed around her like unseen insects. They spoke not of her actions but of her bloodline, tarnished by her uncle's supposed mismanagement of crown funds, an accusation launched by rivals eager to wound her family. The humiliation struck swiftly, without mercy, as if the entire city had agreed that disgrace made the perfect entertainment for an otherwise dull winter season. She felt the air thicken with judgment, and though no finger touched her, she winced as though bruised. She tried to defend her uncle's integrity, but her voice stumbled in the onslaught of murmured suspicion, and her cheeks burned with a mixture of indignation and fear. She had known society to be cruel, but she had not realized it could turn cold so instantly, nor that people who once greeted her warmly would now avert their eyes as though scandal were contagious. Every step she took seemed weighted with the knowledge that her family's long-cultivated honor could no longer shield her. Even the servants' discreet glances felt sharper than blades, and the silence of former companions felt like exile. By the end of that dreadful evening, Eveline no longer felt like herself. She was a name attached to a rumor, a portrait smudged by careless hands. Her guardians urged her to retreat to the countryside until the truth could be sorted, insisting it would calm the gossip and restore her dignity. With trembling resolve she agreed, though the decision felt less like escape and more like surrender. The journey began under gray skies and an even grayer heaviness within her chest. As her carriage rolled along the frost-bitten roads, she tried to steady her thoughts, telling herself that time away from London might offer perspective. Yet the humiliation clung to her like damp wool, and no measured breath could shake the memory of ladies exchanging glances behind their fans, or of gentlemen offering hollow condolences dripping with concealed delight. She wondered whether she would ever be viewed without suspicion again. The storm that struck mid-journey arrived with abrupt violence, throwing snow across the landscape in thick, blinding swirls. The horses panicked, sensing the treacherous ice beneath their hooves, and the driver fought desperately to maintain control. Eveline clutched the seat as the carriage jolted and skidded, her heart pounding with the sudden fear that fate was not finished with her. A final violent lurch sent her tumbling against the door, and before she could cry out, the carriage careened into a snowdrift and overturned. The shock stole her voice, the cold stole her breath, and the world narrowed into a dizzying blur of white. Crawling out through the shattered doorframe, she tried to stand but her legs wavered. A biting wind lashed at her, forcing its way through the thin layers of her traveling cloak. Each step felt heavier than the last until, at last, she sank to her knees in the whiteness. She thought of London again in those disoriented moments, of closed doors, averted eyes, whispered indictments, and wondered why shame wounded more deeply than the cold. She had always believed that truth prevailed, yet in recent days falsehoods had surged louder, stronger, carried by people who had never cared to know her. She pressed a gloved hand to her forehead, fighting dizziness, but the snow muffled sound and thought alike. Her breath grew shallow, the world dimmed. When she finally collapsed, the quiet seemed almost merciful. It was Duke Alistair Ravenswood who found her, though she would not know his name until much later. He had set out from his estate to inspect storm damage along the outer grounds, his horse's hooves crunching rhythmically in the fresh snow. The Duke was a man known for his steadfast loyalty to the crown, for his austere discipline, and for the solitary dignity he maintained since his parents' passing years before. His life had become a measured existence, dutiful, orderly, respectable, unmarked by either scandal or profound sentiment. Yet when he saw the still form lying near the edge of the drift, a shock crossed his features, the sort he had not felt in years. He dismounted quickly, kneeling beside her with a sense of urgency that surprised even him. Her lashes were tipped with frost, her skin pale beneath the cold, and her breath faint but present. For a heartbeat, he simply looked at her, struck not by beauty alone but by the quiet vulnerability in her expression, as though she were suspended between surrender and hope. Instinct overrode decorum. He lifted her carefully into his arms, feeling the fragile weight of her against his chest. The moment her head rested near his shoulder, something unfamiliar flickered within him, a tremor of protectiveness so swift and profound it unsettled his usually disciplined mind. He wrapped his cloak around her, holding her with a gentleness that belied his stern reputation. As he carried her toward his waiting horse, he found himself studying the faint worry lines at the edge of her brow, as though trying to understand the story behind them. She stirred once, mumbling incoherently, and the sound tightened something in his chest. Her gloved fingers brushed his sleeve, a barely their contact, yet it resonated through him with inexplicable weight. He told himself it was simply the shock of encountering a stranger in peril, nothing more, but the thought rang hollow even as he formed it. When he reached Ravenswood Manor, he issued brisk commands to his household, insisting on a physician, a warm chamber and proper supervision with absolute propriety. Yet beneath his authoritative exterior, an unsettling truth pulsed. The moment he had gathered her from the snow, the world he had arranged so neatly around himself seemed to shift, as though some long-dormant part of him had awakened without permission. He stood at the threshold of her prepared chamber, watching as attendants tended to her, and felt a pull he could neither rationalize nor dismiss. He knew nothing of her name, her station, or her history, yet he could not walk away. And as the physician bent over her still form, delivering cautious assurances of recovery, Alistair Ravenswood realized something else, something deeply inconvenient, utterly unexpected and unmistakably real. He dreaded the question already forming within him, for its answer might alter everything he believed unshakable. The uproar began before Lady Eveline was even fully conscious, echoing down the corridors of Ravenswood Manor like an omen she could not yet name. Servants whispered urgently outside her chamber door, voices sharp with speculation, as though the mere fact of her presence threatened to disturb the estate's strict, carefully maintained order. Their hushed tones wove into her half-waking mind, stirring a familiar dread. London's whispers had followed her even here. When she finally opened her eyes, the remnants of the storm still pressed against the windows, and for a fleeting moment she wondered if she had dreamt everything: the humiliation, the journey, the accident. But the ache in her limbs and the distant echo of gossip insisted otherwise. She attempted to sit, only to feel the room sway. A maid hurried toward her with gentle but wary hands, offering support while carefully avoiding any gesture that might imply undue familiarity. That restraint, subtle yet unmistakable, confirmed Eveline's fear that she was once more a subject of rumor. The physician arrived shortly after, his manner brisk but not unkind. He examined her with professional detachment, declaring that exhaustion and cold had merely overpowered her, and that with rest she would recover fully. Eveline nodded, grateful yet embarrassed to be the object of such attention, especially when she noticed two chaperones stationed discreetly by the door, evidence of a propriety enforced with near military vigilance. She understood the necessity, however much it stung. She was, after all, an unmarried lady rescued by a bachelor duke, and even the suggestion of impropriety could ripple dangerously across society. As she pressed her fingers to her temple, she wondered how long she could remain under a roof where every glance might question her character. Yet beneath her anxiety flickered something quieter, gentler, the memory of strong arms lifting her from the snow, the faint warmth of a voice calling her back from the edge of unconsciousness. She did not know the man's face clearly, but she remembered the steadiness with which he held her, as though he had already resolved not to let go. Duke Alistair Ravenswood entered the chamber later that morning, though not without caution. He paused at the threshold as if weighing the propriety of stepping further. When Eveline lifted her gaze to him, a flicker of surprise passed through his expression, subtle but unmistakably genuine. He bowed with perfect formality, though there was a softness in his eyes that contrasted his otherwise austere bearing. She thanked him with trembling sincerity, her voice fragile from weariness, and he responded with a measured calm that seemed crafted to reassure without overwhelming. He asked after her comfort, her pain, her memory of the accident, but each question carried an undercurrent of deeper concern he never voiced outright. She answered with equal restraint, aware that every word might be overheard by attentive ears. Still, she sensed something in him, a quiet conflict, as though he were torn between duty and an emotion he dared not name. Later that afternoon, when strength returned enough for her to sit by the fire, a maid brought a small object wrapped in linen. Eveline blinked in confusion as she unwrapped it to reveal a beautifully bound book of poetry, its edges worn with time but carefully preserved. Inside the cover, a short note in a firm, elegant hand read only, * for your comfort as you recover. May its verses offer warmth where silence cannot. * no name was signed and none was needed. The gesture was modest by aristocratic standards, yet profoundly intimate in spirit. Eveline pressed the book to her chest for a moment, overwhelmed by a tenderness she had not expected. But her solace was short-lived. She noticed the maid's barely concealed curiosity, the way the girl lingered for a heartbeat too long before departing. The realization struck with unwelcome clarity: even gifts given in kindness could be twisted into scandal. Her fears proved justified an hour later when the Duchess Dowager arrived unannounced, her footsteps sharp against the polished floors. Alistair's aunt swept into the chamber with a presence that demanded attention, her expression composed yet faintly disapproving. She examined Evelyn with an assessing gaze, neither hostile nor warm, merely calculating. The older woman inquired after Evelyn's health, but her polite words concealed a sharper meaning beneath. She mentioned, in the tone of someone delivering a neutral observation, that the household staff was quite animated by the unexpected guest, and that certain assumptions had already begun to circulate. Evelyn felt shame crawl across her skin. She attempted to assure the Duchess Dowager that she had no wish to impose, nor to invite misunderstanding. But the older woman offered only a thin, enigmatic smile before turning to her nephew with a raised brow, silently urging him to consider the reputational dangers. It was Alistair who intervened with quiet but unmistakable firmness. He stated that Evelyn's presence was a matter of necessity, not choice, and that she would remain under his protection until her strength fully returned. His aunt regarded him for a long moment, something like surprise softening her rigid posture. Evelyn, hearing his words, felt a warmth, gentle, tentative, unfurl in her chest. For all society's harshness, for all the whispers that chased her from London, someone believed she deserved dignity. Yet it was not merely gratitude she felt, it was a fragile, blooming hope she did not dare name. The Duchess Dowager eventually departed, leaving behind an atmosphere thick with unspoken tension. Evelyn traced the spine of the poetry book with trembling fingers, contemplating the peculiar safety she felt in this household that was not truly hers. She wondered whether she should request to continue her journey as soon as she could stand without swaying. After all, her presence endangered both her reputation and the Duke's. But when she attempted to voice this to him during his brief evening visit, he simply shook his head, his gaze steady and resolute. He told her the roads were unsafe and that she was not yet recovered enough to travel. His reasoning was practical, but something in his tone hinted at a deeper reluctance, one that mirrored the quiet longing Evelyn barely allowed herself to acknowledge. Yet just as she allowed that tender thought to form, a footman arrived with a sealed letter addressed to her. Evelyn broke the wax, and as her eyes scanned the page, the blood drained from her face. The message was brief but devastating. Word had already spread to nearby estates that she was residing under the Duke's protection, and a gathering had extended an invitation explicitly to welcome her back into respectable company. The phrasing was polite, yet unmistakably laced with expectation and judgment. Evelyn's hands trembled as she folded the letter. The Duke's expression darkened, understanding the implication instantly. If she attended, she would be scrutinized. If she refused, the whispers would worsen. And as the fire crackled gently beside them, she realized the storm she had escaped outside had already begun again within these walls, one made of secrets, suspicions, and the perilous tenderness growing between them. The ballroom erupted in whispers the moment Lady Eveline Harcourt crossed the threshold, and she felt the sting of eyes like icy daggers. The polished floors reflected the glitter of chandeliers, yet the brilliance only highlighted the scrutiny pressing upon her. Every curtsy, every careful step, was measured to the fraction of propriety, yet she sensed the invisible tally being taken. Her posture, her smile, her breathing. For a moment, Evelyn thought the cold of that night's accident had followed her here, curling in the hollow of her stomach. She had rehearsed civility, prepared her politest words, yet the instant she was seen, it seemed the room conspired to remind her that scandal, even subdued, lingered like a shadow behind her back. Duke Alistair Ravenswood remained at her side, a stoic presence amid the murmurs, his expression carefully neutral. Yet beneath the calm facade, tension coiled like a restrained spring. He noted every sideways glance, every pointed whisper, and felt an unfamiliar surge of protectiveness, less duty than something unspoken, something that tugged at the very fibers of him. The ballroom was a theater of light and shadow, and Alistair found himself straining to keep Evelyn shielded from the sharp edges of society, though they could not prevent the small tremors of her anxiety. Her fingers clutched the folds of her gown beneath the velvet of her cloak, gloved hands pressed to the fabric as if to anchor herself. That quiet fragility, so subtle yet so real, stirred a protective instinct he had never allowed himself before. A baroness approached, her fan flicking with deliberate artistry. "My dear Miss Harcourt," she said, voice airy, tinged with the perfumed malice society often disguised as civility. "Pray, have you recovered fully from your unfortunate journey?" Her smile did not reach her eyes. Evelyn's throat tightened, words lodged in her chest like shards of ice. She inclined her head, a curt, cautious nod, and managed to murmur, I am well, thank you. The Baroness's gaze lingered, scanning her attire, the modest cut of her gown, the faint redness on her cheeks, a silent critique masked by a smile. Evelyn felt the weight of judgment pressing her downward, and her confidence, which had only begun to bloom at Ravenswood Manor, wavered. Alistair's presence was steady, unwavering. He spoke only when necessary, his voice low but deliberate. "We must take care not to allow idle speculation to dictate your movements," he murmured, just loud enough for Evelyn to hear. The words were practical yet carried a subtle current of reassurance. She looked at him then, a flicker of gratitude passing over her features. It was a quiet acknowledgement, a mutual understanding that amid society's sharpness, they had each found a brief sanctuary in the other's constancy. But it was also an acknowledgement of something else, an emotion that neither dared name aloud. When the music swelled, Evelyn excused herself, moving toward the terrace with careful steps, her heart pounding in rhythm with the distant violins. The frost had not yet retreated from the marble, and the night air bit through her cloak despite its warmth. She drew a shivering breath, letting her eyes roam across the expanse of moonlit gardens below, the shadows of trees stretching like dark sentinels. She felt as if she were suspended between worlds, the glittering, judgmental ballroom inside and the indifferent, serene night outside. And for a moment she allowed herself to feel the weight of her fear, the loneliness of being scrutinized, the fragility of her current position in society. She did not notice the Duke approach until he spoke, his voice a careful murmur. "The night grows cold, yet it seems you have found warmth in solitude." Evelyn's gaze lifted, meeting his. The intensity of his stare unsettled her, not with threat but with the raw, unspoken force of concern. She had known him only in moments of rescue and propriety, now she saw a depth to him she had not anticipated. In his eyes she glimpsed a life as measured and disciplined as her own restraint, yet one capable of sudden, profound feeling. For a heartbeat, the world shrank to the terrace, the cold biting air, and the shared silence between them. I fear the ballroom," she admitted softly, voice barely above the murmur of the wind. "Every glance feels as though it judges me, even when no accusation is spoken aloud." Her hands fidgeted with the edges of her gloves, twisting the fabric until her fingers ached. She could not meet his eyes fully, afraid of betraying the vulnerability she tried to contain. Yet the need to speak it aloud outweighed the instinct to hide. Her confession, fragile and trembling, carried weight she had not realized until it left her lips. Alistair stepped closer, careful to maintain propriety, yet proximity conveyed more than words could. "You need not fear every shadow, Miss Harcourt," he said, his voice steady, measured, but rich with quiet emotion. "Some whispers are as hollow as the wind through these trees. And some of us see truth where others only see rumor." His hand rested near hers, hovering without touching, a gesture both deliberate and electric. Evelyn felt the tension coil in her chest, a mixture of relief, hope, and an unfamiliar thrill that made her pulse quicken. She did not dare reach for his hand, yet the nearness was enough to unsettle her with longing she could not yet define. I am grateful," she whispered, voice breaking slightly, though she fought to maintain dignity. "For your kindness, your protection. It is more than I dared hope for." Her eyes met his, and she thought she saw a flicker of something like confession in his otherwise controlled demeanor. For a fleeting instant, she allowed herself to imagine that his loyalty might extend beyond duty, that perhaps it included a quiet regard for her alone. Alistair inclined his head slightly, a gesture of both acknowledgement and restraint. "From the moment I lifted you from the snow, I knew my life would not proceed precisely as it had before," he said, carefully modulated, each word deliberate. He did not claim love, he did not profess desire outright. Yet the weight of his declaration, restrained and careful, resonated like a bell tolling in the winter night. Evelyn felt the full force of it, the recognition that someone of such status and composure had been moved to speak with such careful, undeniable honesty. She shivered, though not from the cold. They lingered together on the terrace, the music a distant pulse, the night a quiet witness to their fragile connection. Each glance, each measured word, deepened the unspoken bond. They were a study in restraint and yearning, two souls tethered by circumstance yet aware of something stirring beneath the surface. She realized that while society might judge her and the world might whisper, there existed in this moment a rare sanctuary, a space where truth and feeling were unhidden, yet safe from prying eyes. Eventually the Duke gestured toward the ballroom. "We must return," he said softly but not without reluctance. Evelyn nodded, understanding the necessity. They re-entered the hall, the glittering chandeliers reflecting off polished floors, and the whispers resumed, though she now felt shielded by the presence of the man who had carried her through the storm, both literal and figurative. The knowledge of his regard, carefully veiled though it was, lent her courage. She straightened her posture, her gaze lifted, and for the first time she faced the scrutiny with a measure of defiance tempered by grace. Yet even as they moved among the throng, a thought took root in Evelyne's mind, something tentative, almost frightening in its intimacy. She knew the Duke's restraint was deliberate, a wall of propriety he had chosen to maintain. And she knew that if she dared to breach it even slightly, society's judgment could descend with merciless precision. The tension, the longing, the careful dances of glance and gesture, all of it became a private language, a delicate current flowing beneath the decorum of the evening. She recognized, with both thrill and dread, that the man at her side had awakened something in her heart that would not be easily silenced. As the evening waned and the last strains of music faded, Eveline felt the exhaustion of both body and mind. The glow of candlelight softened against the polished surfaces of the room, yet the weight of unspoken emotion remained. She knew that the path ahead would be fraught with peril, of gossip, of propriety, of her own fragile hopes, but she also recognized that she was no longer entirely alone. There existed a connection, careful, deliberate, and profound, that might yet offer her courage to face the storms to come. And as she returned to the quiet of her temporary chamber, a subtle realization gripped her. The Duke's loyalty was no mere matter of duty. Something deeper had begun, something unacknowledged but undeniable. The memory of his near confession, the warmth of his concern, and the restrained intensity of his presence pressed upon her like the first thawing of winter snow. And in the stillness of that chamber, Eveline understood that the next step, whether towards scandal or salvation, would begin not with the eyes of society, but with the quiet truth they had discovered on the terrace, in the moonlight, together. The letter arrived at Ravenswood Manor with the sudden weight of destiny, carried by a messenger whose hurried steps echoed through the corridors like the toll of a bell. Eveline's hands trembled as she took it, feeling the wax seal cold against her fingertips, her heart beating in anxious rhythm. The parchment was brief yet precise. Her family's name had been cleared of suspicion. Accusations once whispered in London salons were officially retracted. Relief should have washed over her, a cleansing tide of vindication, yet instead a peculiar emptiness settled in her chest. The world outside the manor, which had seemed a threat only days before, now appeared both inviting and perilous, as if the clearing of her family's honor had suddenly illuminated the precariousness of her own place in society. She stared at the letter long after the messenger had departed, her mind a whirl of gratitude, fear, and uncertainty. Alistair entered the room then, his expression measured, yet there was a tension in his posture that betrayed the depth of his concern. Eveline looked up, eyes wide, and he inclined his head. "The news has arrived," he said quietly, each word deliberate, weighted. "I trust it brings you relief?" She folded the letter, her fingers lingering over the seal as if it were a talisman. "It does," she admitted softly. And yet, her voice faltered, leaving the ellipsis suspended in the air. She dared not articulate the unease she felt, the realization that the clearing of her family's name might also signal the end of her temporary sanctuary, the end of the delicate bubble in which she had begun to find solace, even affection. The Duke observed her closely, understanding without explanation. He recognized the internal conflict twisting her features, the relief of vindication, the fear of returning to the harsh gaze of society, and the quiet, growing attachment she had begun to feel for him. He remained silent for a long moment, the weight of unspoken words pressing upon the room like the low, steady hum of an approaching storm. When he finally spoke, it was with a careful mixture of authority and gentleness. "It seems the world expects your presence once more," he said, his eyes holding hers with steady intent. "And yet I cannot imagine sending you forth unaccompanied, nor leaving you to face their scrutiny alone." The propriety of his speech did little to mask the personal emotion underlying it, and Eveline felt her pulse quicken, caught between the relief of his protection and the anxiety of the challenges that awaited beyond the manor gates. Preparations for her departure began at dawn. The chamber was filled with the quiet rustle of silk and the muted thrum of activity. Servants moved discreetly, their hands deftly folding gowns and sealing letters, all while maintaining the delicate line between care and observation. Eveline herself attended to her packing with meticulous care, as if folding her garments with precision might somehow impose order upon the chaos of her thoughts. She paused occasionally, glancing at the window where the winter light spilled softly across the polished floor, a stark contrast to the cold she had endured during her journey. Every shadow seemed to whisper of the choices she would have to make, the judgments she could not evade, and the emotions she dared not fully acknowledge. Alistair, meanwhile, wrestled with his own internal turmoil. The clarity of her family's vindication brought relief, yet it also posed a new threat: the inevitability of her departure. Every moment he had spent in her presence, every careful glance exchanged, every restrained gesture of concern, had solidified into a subtle yet unshakable bond. He had come to treasure her strength, her courage, and the gentle spark of wit that persisted even in the face of scandal. Now, with the certainty of her journey looming, he felt the stirrings of an emotion he could no longer deny, one that demanded acknowledgement despite the rigid rules of propriety and the looming expectations of society. When the carriage was ready, the morning sun glinting weakly off the snow, Eveline's hands hovered near the doorframe, hesitant. Alistair appeared, his presence commanding yet tempered by a careful restraint that only deepened her fascination with him. "Are you prepared for the roads?" he asked, voice steady, yet carrying a subtle inflection of concern. Eveline nodded, though the motion lacked conviction. She had rehearsed her farewells 100 times in her mind, yet the reality was a storm that she could neither control nor predict. Alistair's eyes lingered on hers, and in that gaze she saw an unspoken promise, that no matter the scrutiny of society he would not abandon her. The first tremor of uncertainty passed as she settled into the carriage, the door closing with a soft click that seemed to mark the threshold between two worlds, the security of Ravenswood Manor and the perilous openness of society once more. Yet before the horses could pull away, Alistair's voice stopped her. "Miss Harcourt," he said, deliberate, each syllable resonating with both formality and emotion. She looked up, startled by the intensity behind his calm tone. "If you leave without hearing me, I shall regret the silence for the rest of my life." The words struck her with the force of sudden clarity, a confession tempered by propriety yet charged with undeniable emotion. She felt her breath catch, her heart respond, and a shiver, both of anticipation and fear, ran along her spine. Eveline's mind raced. The proprieties, the expectations, the whispers of society, all pressed upon her with oppressive weight. Yet the Duke's declaration, restrained yet heartfelt, carved a space within her where those pressures could not reach. She understood then that this was no mere courtesy, no simple duty of the gentleman. It was something deeper, more intimate, though carefully contained within the bounds of respect. Her fingers brushed against the folded lace of her gloves as if testing her own courage, and she realized that the choice before her was not merely whether to heed society's demands, but whether to acknowledge the stirrings of her own heart. "Your words honor me," she said softly, carefully measured, yet infused with sincerity. "And I cannot disregard them lightly." Her voice faltered, but her gaze remained steady. Alistair inclined his head, recognizing the delicate balance she maintained between acknowledgement and propriety. He understood the restraint not as hesitation alone, but as a reflection of her strength, her dignity, and the grace with which she navigated the treacherous currents of expectation. For all the risks, for all the scrutiny, she had chosen to hear him, and in doing so, had bridged the distance between caution and trust. The carriage jolted as the horses began their journey once more, yet the moment lingered between them, suspended like the faint warmth of firelight at the edge of a shadowed hall. Eveline pressed a hand to the ribbon tied at her throat, a silent reminder of the small comforts she carried from Ravenswood Manor. The poetry book, the careful attention, the quiet protection of a man who had moved her with gestures both restrained and profound. Alistair's figure receded from view only when the last shadow of the estate dissolved into the winter morning, yet his presence remained, etched into her mind with an intensity that neither time nor distance could diminish. As the carriage wound along the frost-lined roads, Eveline reflected on the profound shifts of the past days. The accident, the rescue, the tentative trust forged under the roof of the Duke's estate, and now the declaration that carried both propriety and undeniable yearning. Her heart, which had begun the week weighed with fear and humiliation, now beat with cautious hope. Yet hope, she knew, was never unaccompanied by risk. Society awaited her, judgmental and unrelenting, and each step beyond the manor's gates demanded courage she had scarcely felt she possessed. She closed her eyes briefly, willing herself to steady her breathing, to prepare for the scrutiny and the subtle dangers of a world that thrived on whispers. Yet even amid that uncertainty, a spark remained. The Duke's words, measured and deliberate, had carved a place of truth in her heart. She could not yet name it, could not yet embrace it fully, but she sensed its presence like the first stirrings of spring beneath the frost. And though she faced the peril of society's gaze, she understood that this bond, quiet, restrained, yet profound, would guide her steps, protect her spirit, and perhaps, in time, allow her to embrace something that had been denied her in London: the certainty of being seen, known, and valued for who she truly was. And as the carriage carried her further from Ravenswood Manor, Evelyn felt the subtle, irresistible pull of possibility, the knowledge that while society would continue to judge, there existed a connection beyond gossip and expectation, delicate yet unshakable. She dared to imagine a future in which judgment could be tempered by understanding, where propriety and passion might coexist. And in the quiet of her compartment, as snowflakes brushed against the windows, she whispered a tentative vow to herself, to follow where truth and courage might lead, even if the path remained shrouded in winter's shadow. The snow fell with a quiet persistence that morning, blanketing the grounds of Ravenswood Manor in a hushed, almost reverential white. Evelyn watched it from the carriage window, each flake drifting like a delicate whisper across the landscape, and felt her heart tighten with a mixture of anticipation and fear. Today was not merely another journey, it was the day she would either step fully into society once more or retreat into the fragile sanctuary she had come to rely upon. Her fingers twisted the edges of her gloves, each crease a reminder of the proprieties she must uphold, each fold a testament to the courage she had gathered over the past weeks. And yet, beneath the weight of expectation, there remained a tremor of hope, a quiet, persistent warmth she could not explain. Alistair's presence, steadfast and unwavering, awaited her at the estate's outer gates. Even before the carriage halted, she could see the familiar posture, the straight shoulders, the subtle tension in his hands, the careful watchfulness of eyes that had become her anchor. He did not approach until the door swung open, his movements measured, precise, as if every gesture were being weighed against the strictures of propriety. Yet even in his restraint, there was something unmistakable, relief, concern, and an emotion neither of them had dared name aloud. Evelyn stepped down, her skirts brushing the snow, and felt the cold bite at her cheeks, a sharp contrast to the warmth coursing through her chest at the sight of him. "The roads are treacherous," he said, voice steady, though his eyes betrayed a quiet urgency. "You should not risk them alone." His words were practical, yet layered with the unspoken, a desire not to lose her again, a hope that the bond forged under storm and shadow might endure. Evelyn inclined her head, the slightest hint of a smile brushing her lips. "And yet I find no fear while you are near," she murmured, voice soft but clear. The words were a delicate bridge between propriety and confession, a subtle acknowledgement that what had begun in quiet moments of rescue had grown into something far more profound. They walked together through the manor grounds, the snow muffling their steps, creating a stillness that felt almost sacred. Each glance, each careful movement, carried the weight of restrained emotion. Evelyn's thoughts drifted back to the first moments in his arms, when the storm had seemed insurmountable, and she realized with startling clarity that she had never truly known safety until that instant. And now years of expectation, whispers, and judgment seemed to fall away beneath the gentle authority of his presence. For the first time she felt the possibility of being truly seen, truly valued, without artifice or pretense. Alistair led her to the winter garden, a secluded enclave where frost clung to every branch and the soft whiteness of snow framed the hedges like lace. It was a place removed from the scrutiny of servants, from the ever-watchful eyes of society, a private stage for a delicate, yet inevitable reckoning. Evelyn inhaled sharply, the crisp air filling her lungs, and felt the weight of anticipation tighten in her chest. She sensed, without fully understanding, that the moment they had both been approaching since the night of her accident had arrived. Every glance, every half-spoken thought, every carefully measured gesture had led them here. Alistair turned to her then, the snowlight glinting across the planes of his face, highlighting the intensity of his gaze. "Miss Harcourt," he began, voice steady yet intimate, "the moments since I found you in the snow have altered the course of my days more profoundly than I had believed possible." His gloved hands remained folded before him, yet the tension in his posture spoke of emotions long restrained. Evelyn's breath caught, and she felt her pulse quicken in tandem with the rhythm of her own anticipation. She understood the gravity in his words, recognized the careful balance between declaration and restraint, and yet she could not look away. "You speak with caution, yet there is sincerity beneath it," she whispered, voice trembling with emotion she barely allowed herself to feel. "I have come to understand that not all who witness scandal are cruel, and not all who speak of propriety are unfeeling. You have shown me something rare, something steadfast." Her words, though measured, carried the weight of revelation, a recognition that her trust, tentative though it had been, was met with care and regard that transcended expectation. Alistair inclined his head, a faint flicker of warmth softening his usual reserve. "I have come to value you beyond duty or decorum," he said, voice low but resonant, each syllable deliberate. Beyond the judgment of society, beyond the reach of whispers. From the instant I held you in the snow, I knew that the quiet fortitude you possess is matched only by the courage of your heart. He paused, the snow falling silently around them like a witness to their truth, and then extended a gloved hand toward her. May I offer you my hand not merely as guardian but as something closer, something of my own choosing? Eveline's fingers hovered over his for a moment, caught between propriety and longing. She could feel the tremor in her own chest, the undeniable pull that had been growing since their first encounter. With a soft, decisive breath, she placed her gloved hand in his. The touch was light, reverent, yet it carried the full force of all the unspoken words, all the restrained emotion that had built between them. Neither spoke immediately. The silence was more eloquent than any declaration, a quiet acknowledgement of the bond that had blossomed in moments of danger, care, and shared vulnerability. A distant sound of carriage wheels reminded them of the world beyond the garden, of society's expectations and the duties still waiting for Eveline. Yet in that moment the snow-blanketed enclave became a sanctuary, and they stood together, hands joined, hearts aligned, in a quiet communion that no whisper could diminish. She lifted her gaze, meeting his eyes fully for the first time without hesitation, and in them she saw a reflection of her own longing, a mirror of trust, courage, and profound, restrained affection. Whatever the world demands, Alistair murmured, we shall face it together. The judgment of London, the expectations of the ton, they hold no power here, not in this moment. His words, measured yet charged, were a promise and a protection, a bridge between the fragile beginnings of hope and the possibility of enduring connection. Eveline felt her chest swell with a warmth that had little to do with the winter air, a heat born of recognition and the quiet triumph of trust earned through trial and care. The day passed in gentle progression, servants discreetly attending to their duties without intrusion, allowing the Duke and his guest a space that society would not grant. Afternoon sunlight, pale and glinting against the snow, filled the windows with a soft glow. Eveline traced the frost patterns absent-mindedly, reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. The accident, the whispers of scandal, the steady presence of a man who had defied expectation to offer safety, protection, and the subtle stirrings of affection. Each memory underscored the magnitude of the moment, a delicate crescendo that had been building from the instant she had collapsed into snow and found herself in his arms. As twilight approached, the garden's shadows deepened, and the snow began to melt slightly under the day's weak warmth. Eveline understood that this day marked not an end, but a beginning. She had survived humiliation, feared judgment, and faced uncertainty, yet she now stood in a place of quiet triumph, acknowledged, protected, and cherished. The Duke's presence was no longer merely a shield, it was a living testament to the possibility of trust, affection, and love emerging even amid a world governed by strictures, whispers, and rigid expectation. Finally, as the last light faded and the stars began to pierce the evening sky, Alistair lowered his head slightly, voice tender yet measured. You are safe here, Miss Harcourt. And in my care, you shall be valued as you deserve, beyond the reach of scandal, beyond the constraints of duty, beyond the cold indifference of the world. Eveline felt her breath catch, understanding the full weight of his words. It was more than a promise, it was a covenant, a recognition of the truth that had quietly grown between them. She pressed her gloved fingers to his, a delicate seal of consent and trust, and in that touch, the first spark of mutual acknowledged love settled like the snow upon the garden, serene, enduring, and luminous. And as they stood together in the quiet of winter's end, the snow whispering softly around them, Eveline realized that the bond forged in adversity, in fear, in whispered concerns and stolen glances, had achieved its full measure. From the moment he lifted her from the snow, a seed had been planted, one that now bloomed into certainty, into warmth, into a shared life beyond judgment or fear. The journey ahead remained uncertain, the world beyond still fraught with expectation and scrutiny, yet within the delicate sanctuary of the moment she knew that love, steadfast and true, had taken root. And she understood finally that no winter, no scandal, no whisper, no shadow of doubt, could undo what had been wrought in those quiet, determined moments of trust and courage.